Good morning. Now, yesterday we had difficulty displaying documents. I understand that that problem may have been fixed. Always just a little bit tentative when it comes to technology. All being well, we should be able to display documents. However, I think to help legal representatives, we've distributed a list of the documents that Mr. Connell anticipates referring to today. It may not be a comprehensive list, but the attempt has been made to give as much notice to legal representatives as may be. Now, Mr. Connell.
Good morning, my lord. There is one witness scheduled for today, Mr. Ian Powrie.
Good morning, Mr. Powrie.
Morning.
Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who I think you may have met,
Yes.
and is sitting opposite you. But first, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes.
Just sit where you are, raise your right hand, and repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Now, I anticipate you'll be giving evidence over the course of the day. We usually take a coffee break about 11:30, so there will be a break in the course of the morning. But if at any stage you want to take a break for whatever reason at all, just give me an indication, and we can take that break.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Connell.
Thank you, my lord. Well, good morning, Mr. Powrie. I think you produced a statement in response to questions from the inquiry,
Yes.
and you have access to that statement. Is that correct?
Yes.
And are you content to adopt that statement as your evidence at this inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Powrie, just before we start in the formal questions, I'm conscious that you've been retired. We'll get the date just a minute, but for about 5 years now.
That's correct.
If at any time I ask you a question that you don't know the answer to for some reason, please just tell me and tell me what the reason is. And if I ask you a question that you don't remember, you're free to simply indicate that to me if that's your answer to the question. Otherwise, in your statement, Mr. Powrie, you set out your various qualifications and so forth. Originally, perhaps focused on the electrical world rather
Yes.
than other areas of estate management. Is that
Yes.
correct?
That's correct.
I'll just ask you a general question at this point, which has been suggested to me. Thinking back now, do you think it would have been helpful to you as an estate manager to have had more training in matters relating to infection control?
Yeah. Yes, I think it would.
Good. Again, just so we understand the sequence of appointments that you had, essentially your time that's relevant to us, as I understand it, splits into 3, and we can find this on page 3 of your statement, 210 of the electronic version. So you have a project role. This is answer 3 near the top. You have a project role between August 2012 and September 2015. We'll come to that in a second. And then you become a sector estates manager. And that runs until January 2017.
Yes.
When you become, I think, Mr. Alan Gallagher's deputy.
That's correct.
In a wider role within the board.
Yes.
That's correct. And you stay with the board until July 2019?
That's correct. Yes.
When you retire. Is
Yes.
that correct? Thank you very much. Just one point on 211. just on the top paragraph, because at one point later, you said in your statement something along the lines like, well, at one point I was reporting to 3 different managers.
Yes.
So I thought I would just ask you about this here. You seem to say here you reported to Alan, that's Alan Gallagher presumably, on technical matters, Billy Hunter, operational, and David Loudon on issues relating to defects,
Yes.
broadly speaking. Is that correct? Is
That's
that what
correct.
you meant with the 3 different
Yes.
lines?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I only really have one question about your project role, because you deal with that at 212, the next page of your statement at the foot of the page. And you explain some of the things you were doing, particularly about your role as the authorised person for high voltage.
Yes.
Obviously an electrical role and some other things. But the one thing you mentioned there was you were developing a strategic maintenance manpower plan.
Yes.
So that was actually something you were asked to do. It wasn't just something you
Yes,
did.
David Loudon asked me to develop that, yes.
David Loudon asked you to
Yes.
develop it. Thank you. And we get some more relevant dates, perhaps on 214. In the answer 10, where you confirm your retirement date, and you were deputising for Alan Gallagher, supporting your successor in the estates role, and then you had a particular role in what's been described as the water incident,
Yes.
which is in 2018. We know.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, one of the issues I am keen to get from you, Mr. Powrie, is the issue of staffing. Because, as we'll see later in your statement, you explain some of the consequences of staffing issues.
Yes.
As matters proceeded. And still on 214, in the second half of the page, you're asked, well, when did you start to have questions about staffing? And am I right in understanding that the gist was that you'd worked out how many people on a calculated method that you thought you needed?
Yes.
And I think later in your statement, you give that number as, I think, 111.
That's, yeah, round about there, yeah.
Round about there. I think the way these things are expressed in your statement, you talk about numbers WTE.
Whole-time equivalent.
Whole-time equivalent.
Yes.
Right, so that could be 2 part-timers for 1 full-timer.
Yes, yeah.
Or something. Yeah.
It's unusual for part-time, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, so it's whole-time equivalent staff numbers.
Yes.
And that's what you reckoned. And were you told you could have 111 people?
No. From recollection, the paper was submitted to David Loudon, who then took that to the board, I believe, particularly Robert Calderwood.
Mr. Calderwood, I think, was the chief executive of the board at the time.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the feedback I got from David was that Robert Calderwood had advised that the board was working to the outline business case finance structure for estates, and that the budget stated in that outline business case was fixed. So we had to go back and rework the budget to align with that.
Did that mean you ended up with 110 of your 111 or a lot less?
No, I think from memory, we ended up down around about 68.
Right.
And that's including management and supervisory staff.
Yeah. So,
This is my fault, I think, probably for not paying close enough attention. When you're asked about your estimate of
Yes.
your requirements as being at 111 full-time equivalent, could I just check what time we're talking about and for what responsibility we're talking about?
Well, the time frame that was, I think, submitted in about 2014.
2014.
And in terms of, I'm not sure what you mean in terms
Well,
of...
we've identified your responsibility on the project board.
Yes.
Is this 111 estates personnel for what is now referred to as the Queen Elizabeth campus, or is it a larger area or a smaller area?
It was for the Queen Elizabeth campus, but taking into account the retained, what we called the retained estate.
Yes.
So that was the old property that was to remain on the campus, as well as the Queen Elizabeth Adults, Children's, Laboratory Medicine, Energy Centre, and, as I say, retained estate.
Right. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Cole.
Yeah, that's Donald. So, do you happen to know the gap between what you'd worked out, you reckon you needed, and what you were told you could have? First of all, was there a point at which you had to lose posts even from what you'd selected?
From the 68?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there was, after we went operational, I think for the first year, possibly 2 years, I can't quite recall the time frame for that, the staffing levels were protected against any, what they call CRES savings.
Right.
So that was cash releasing efficiency savings.
Cash releasing, this is just for the notes, cash releasing efficiency savings.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
And
so they were protected for a while.
I would say a year to 2 years. It would either be a year or 2 years. I just can't remember the actual time frame.
Yep.
But then we had to fall back in line with the programme for annual efficiency savings, and I believe we lost 2 whole-time equivalents on, say, the second year in relation to our contribution to the CRES savings.
Thank you. I was just thinking, and if you don't know the answer to this, please just say so. I mean, the gap between what you'd calculated and what you were told you could have. Did anyone, to your knowledge, do some kind of risk assessment on what the consequences would be of constraining the staff numbers in that way?
No. And just for clarity, the 68, I wasn't told that that's what I could have. I worked with our finance manager to align the available budget to what was affordable. In fact, that's what we called it, the affordability model.
And if we just look at the top of the next page, 215, in the electronic bundle, page 8 in the statement, I think you're describing there what happened in January 2017 or thereabouts, when you handed over to someone else.
Yes.
In your role, and he did his own calculation of what he thought he needed.
Yes.
And you've recorded here that he thought he needed about 108, which is
that's correct.
Yeah, similar. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I'll just ask you one more general question first. The role that you took on in 2017, that was as a deputy to Alan Gallagher, and I don't think there's any controversy about this. You were simply given his job description and said, help me with that. That's probably what happened. Well, that's fine. I don't need to ask you about that because we've got Mr. Gallagher's job description for another reason. And at that point, when you sort of moved out of your estates, I think you described that you were working more on major projects.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah,
for the first period of time, I was kind of mopping up ongoing issues within the Queen Elizabeth. So I was dealing with issues that were outstanding with departments and snags, problems, etc. And then I think the next thing I was involved with as a project entity was the cladding issue in relation to Grenfell.
Yeah, and just for reference, we find you explaining that on 217 at the first main answer there, where you list a number of things that you were involved in.
Yeah.
And I won't take you back to back, but moving to the point where you've been told you can't have all the staff you asked for, you've tried to work out how many you can fit within the budget. You've started in January 2015 to be responsible for the building once it was handed over.
Yes.
How did the staff numbers impact on working conditions for you and your team?
Well, in January 2015, we didn't even have that because these were all staff that had to be redeployed from the demitting sites. So until those sites were closed, the staff for the Queen Elizabeth weren't made available. So at that time in January 2015, I had 5 staff who were all managers, who were redeployed and now pre-opening, but not long before the opening.
Yeah. And did you subsequently gather together the rest of the numbers?
Yes, as the sites decanted and then the demitting sites were decommissioned, the staff started to come across. But it wasn't on a single transfer day, it was fed over a period of time.
Yeah. And did this have an impact on how long you and your team had to work in terms of hours?
Yes, in terms of at point of handover, the volume of work that was to be done in relation to ongoing construction issues, commissioning for the occupation, and just problems that were arising with the building. Personally, I was working 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and the staff that were working with me weren't quite working as long, but they were certainly working longer hours.
Thank you. I'll just pick up on a couple of these points at page 219 of I'm using the electronic numbers at the top of the page, Mr. Powrie, just for ease. But if you look at the middle of the page there, you say you were concerned about the workload, and you're talking about things such as the pneumatic transport system. I think
Yes.
that was a system designed to allow things like samples to be sent from one location in the
Yes.
hospital to another in a kind of pneumatic tube.
Yes.
Was that something that was causing problems at the time?
Oh, it was causing major disruption to the clinical service, and the system was actually breaking down, or canisters were getting lost or trapped in the system. Transfer stations were locking up. So there was major issues trying to keep that going, and it was having an adverse impact on clinical service, A&E waiting times, etc. And it was a high pressure issue from a clinical perspective to keep it online.
Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but am I right in thinking that the reason that it was having a clinical impact is it was often used for sending samples for analysis or testing or something like that, so that somebody
Yes.
could get results quickly?
Yes, the laboratory building is remote from the ward building, and in order to streamline that process, the system was installed. But when it broke down, we didn't have the portering staff to be able to transfer the samples the way they would have been in the past. So it had a big impact on speed of turnaround.
The other thing that you mentioned, and we'll just get it out so we know what it is, you mentioned AGVs. Is that automatic guided vehicles?
That's correct, yes.
Which are little sort of mini robots that move around
Yes.
the hospital from place to place. And were they also causing issues at that time?
Well, they weren't commissioned at the point of handover. They were commissioned just prior to occupation. Right. And there were issues with that as well in terms of software, the automatic guidance system, just various things in relation to the breakdown of the service. On top of that, we didn't have a service support contract in place because the manufacturer had been taken over by another company and had to reevaluate their service offering before they could offer a contract. So we were actually dealing with that now with a reduced service from the manufacturer.
As the estate manager, this issue of not having enough people must have been worrying to you, was it not?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, in terms of those issues, I was personally having to deal with those. The pneumatic tube system, it would generally fail after hours or just at the end of the day. So I was staying on to get these things sorted out and keep them going. And to an extent, I was the only person that had had any training on the PTS system. So it generally fell to me to try and get the thing back into service. Although I did have some support from the other team that I had on site.
Yeah. I think you mentioned on that page Mr. Bratty and Mr. Purden as two of that team.
Yes.
And I mean, did you try to complain, protest, find out if it could be made better?
Yeah, I did highlight the pressures, but they were just expected to get on with it and do what needed to be done.
Yeah, is that the response that you got?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, another issue that I want to take you to, which is not unconnected to the first one, I've entitled it firefighting, which I think is probably a phrase that you recognise, and you touch on that on 220. And just before I look at that, because you've provided a whole list of things as examples of what you were having to do at the time.
Yes.
Is that because you weren't simply sort of getting on with routine maintenance? There was other stuff happening as well?
Yes, we had stuff happening on retained estate. There was issues happening once I became responsible for the wider sector, including Clyde. There were issues happening in those sites as well that I was having to manage.
You've provided a list of different things here, and I don't think I need to take you through all of it because we can read it for ourselves. But just in a general sense, were the things that cropped up things that tended to take quite a lot of time to sort out?
Yes. And they tended to extend over long periods of time. They weren't instant solutions. It took time to get things settled down and working as they should. Right.
So if we took the first bullet point on 220 under the large A, you're talking about blockages causing sewage discharges into wards.
Yes.
But that wasn't evident until you had people in the wards.
Yeah, to be fair, it mainly affected, there was two issues there. There was one where there were blockages on the risers that the wards fed into,
right.
And then there was blockages on the sewer lines underground, external to the building. So the underground ones caused impact on A&E in both adults and children's, and the risers caused impact on generally wards in various areas, particularly the children's.
And that impact was stuff getting discharged?
Yeah, well, it's sewage being discharged into the ward on the floors, coming up through sinks, wash hand basins, etc.
Yeah. Now, further on that page, you deal with the AGVs and you deal with the pneumatic system, which I don't think I need to ask you about again. So we go on to 221, where your list continues. Might just ask you about the LTHW push fit connections.
Yes.
What was happening with them?
Well, these were connectors that in all areas there were heater batteries or chill beams. So these either give cooling or heating into the discrete area. They're connected to the chilled water system and the LTHW system with flexible connections on what they call push fit connectors.
So is that what it means? You
Yes.
just push them together and
You've got your spigot on the battery, and you push fit the connection
Right.
onto the spigot, and then it holds itself in place. And you have two connections for each battery, one flow, one return.
And what happened?
Well, what happened there was the pressure for these push fit connections was higher than the connectors were designed for, so they were tending to blow off and then flood the area affected by the fact that the connector had blown off.
And was this one connector that blew off, or was it a whole?
There was multiple that was happening across the site, to the extent that system, we also had the damage that caused to rectify. Now, when I'm saying we had to manage it, but
Sure.
Brookfield were responsible for repairing or replacing any damaged materials.
Yep. Well, you've given us a very long list, and we probably don't have time to go through them all. Can we just look at page 222? You mentioned there, because I think it's cropped up in statements that the inquiry's heard from others about what you've described as interstitial window blind failures. Now,
Yes.
that's a window blind which is contained within panes of glass, is it?
That's correct, yes.
And that allows you to open and shut the blind.
Yes.
And were these causing problems?
There was no problem with the blind itself. What was wrong was they had an external wand, as it was called, and that connected on a flexible connection at the top of the window onto the blind, and the wand was rotated left or right to open or close the blind. The difficulty was that these wands were detachable, and patient staff didn't know how to use them properly, and invariably were breaking the connection. And that was a whole task to get back into that, to repair these connections.
Yep.
So that was seen as a user issue by Multiplex rather than a defect. And I had to come up with a redesigned solution to go around and replace those on all the windows.
Could I ask a question going back to the
The fins are used to disperse heat
right?
or cooling.
So it's a component within the chill beam.
Yes.
Yes, it's just that the battery suggests electricity. And
Yes, I understand. Yep.
I'm with you now. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, Mr.
Right,
Cook.
well, let me just ask you about another one, because I'm conscious that you've said, well, this is stuff I can remember, but it's not exhaustive.
Yeah.
But halfway down 222, there's reference to ensuite shower flooring issues. Now, again, I think the inquiry has had some evidence from others about this topic, where you've noted here, water not running to drain. Multiplex insisted this was due to the client's instruction to remove the shower curtains.
Yes.
How does that work? I'm not quite sure I'm understanding that.
I wasn't quite sure either. The problem was that the floors weren't graded properly for the water in. This is a wet room. It's not just a shower. It's a wet room. So it's got the WC wash hand basin and the shower in it. And the floor should be graded to fall to drain, so that any water that's dispersed from the shower runs to drain. The floors weren't graded effectively enough to achieve that. Now, when that was raised, Multiplex tried various options to do something to actually achieve that without redoing the whole thing, none of which were really successful. But prior to contract handover, there was a request from Infection Control to remove shower curtains from the design, because they seen shower curtains as an infection risk. Invariably they get wet and mould develops on them, so they wanted to remove that as a risk. That was related to Multiplex, and the shower curtains were removed. And not, basically, when I say removed, not installed. They were never there. So when we started having this problem, Multiplex's view was that the shower curtains would have retained the water in the area where the drain was, and therefore the removal of the shower curtains allowed the water to now extend beyond the boundary of the shower, and therefore that's why it wasn't running to drain.
And I mean, I think it'll be obvious to everybody. What we're talking about are wet rooms,
Yes.
which are associated with bedrooms, because you have a single.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the policy is patients accommodated, generally speaking, in single rooms, and patients will have a wet room available as an ensuite to these.
Yes, it's dedicated ensuite to each bedroom, yes.
Right. And did this problem arise in all the levels of the hospital?
It was fairly universal. It wasn't all rooms, but there was now a high number of rooms that were affected by it.
Right. And that would include level 2 and wards 2A and ward 2A.
And the children's, it would include that, but I can't remember specific instances of it.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You produced this list, which is no doubt very helpful to us, Mr. Powrie. Is this the kind of thing you were expecting to have to deal with?
Yes.
There's all this kind of firefighting.
Yeah. These were fairly routine types of issues that we had to deal with.
Yeah. Now, in the next sections of your report, of your statement, you deal with training and other issues, which I don't need to ask you about. Can I just ask you a general question that comes from that? In terms of commissioning the water system or commissioning and validating the ventilation system, were you involved in either of these processes?
No.
Thank you. And were you involved in anything involving the design of the hospital?
No, I was a chap called Brian Gillespie. He was a Secretary of State's manager, Secretary of State's manager from Clyde at the time. This would be back 2006-07. We were asked to meet with the shadow design team. That's the people that put together the outline spec for the contract. And that was with a view to adding operational experience into the design requirements. So if they were looking at electrical distribution systems, giving a feel for what operational issues would maybe arise from that. But that was the only input that I had in relation to design.
And that would be because at that stage, your primary focus as part of the project side was on electrical matters.
I was still an operational estates manager at that time for the north east of the city. So I wasn't part of the project team then. So it was basically only to get a perspective of design issues and improvements that could be made to the operational side of things.
Okay. I'd like to move on to 232, which is page 25 on the original numbering, and to the foot of that page. And I probably don't need to take you to documents for this, Mr. Powrie, with a bit of luck. But I think you were asked about something called the ZBP ventilation strategy.
Yes.
And you said you only saw it when concerns start to be raised about air change rates. Is that correct?
Yes.
Had you been consulted about it or knew about it before then?
No, I wasn't part of the project team in 2009 when that was proposed. I found out about it. In fact, I didn't find out about it when I asked the question initially. When I asked the question initially about the air change rates not being as per guidance, I was referred to the I can't remember the name of the
clarification
log. Yes. So I read the clarification log, and it just said that it had been proposed to change the design of the air change rate in relation to chill beams being adopted, and that this was approved. And in fact, I think the control strategy for that was to be for slightly negative pressure in the rooms to be achieved, and an extra amount was paid to achieve that.
I've jumped ahead a little of my page numbering, so just so we're clear where you cover this, on 233, original page 26, what you explain in the large paragraph with the letter A against it, was that what drew you to this issue was that questions were raised by infection control.
Yes,
And then you were supporting Dr. Peters, and you found what the air change rate was and so on, and you thought there was a problem, and then you were told, well, it's all in the clarification log.
yes,
And then people asked more questions, and then you referred to that ventilation strategy.
yes.
So that's how you came
Yeah,
to
yeah,
know
that
about
was, it wasn't shared right away, it was shared after 2 or 3 iterations of questions.
Thank you. Now, the next topic that I'd like to take from you, because you've told us about the impact of not having enough people. You've told us about the impact of having to firefight a whole range of stuff that had cropped up. I want to ask you about the effectiveness of what I might call I was about to call it the paperwork, although people will now tell me it's all online, so you shouldn't call it paperwork anymore. But you know what I mean, management systems to assist you as an estates manager to do your job. And we'll end up talking about, I think, 3 things. One is Zutec, which I'll come back to. The other is something called CAMF.
You CAFM? Yep.
Have I got that right? CAFM.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And the other is something called asset tagging.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you about these just so we understand what was happening. You touch on this, I think. Let me just ask you though, first of all, Zutec. What is Zutec as far as you understood it?
Zutec is a document management system, so similar to say the paperwork. So all of what they call post-commissioning documentation should have been loaded onto Zutec, and that would be our reference to all matters, design, installation, commissioning, etc. should all be contained within that documentation.
Yeah.
For future reference, and if there's modifications to be made to allow that to be built upon.
Yeah. And we've heard a little about Zutec from other witnesses. Can I just ask you generally, was Zutec easy to use?
No. I mean, in principle, it's a simple register, a menu of documents, and you should be able to penetrate that menu to find the relevant information you're looking for. So if it was ventilation, you would expect to go through ventilation or environmental ventilation, air handling unit, chill beam, and find the topic you're looking for. It wasn't as simple as that. Invariably, you'd be looking for something for ventilation, and it would be in a different folder altogether for a different topic. The information wasn't always in Zutec. We had to go and ask for it to be made available, and it just was very difficult to navigate.
And am I right in thinking that it wasn't available on day one? It wasn't available until several months later.
Yeah,
I think a 2 month period. Is that right?
Yes. Point of handover, we were expecting to be able to go in and get information that we needed for various tasks that were to be performed. And I was advised that Zutec, by Multiplex, I think it was David Wilson, advised me that they had a 2 month grace period from contract completion for the full population of Zutec. And that was verified by the project team.
Yeah. So it wasn't operational immediately, and then it was difficult to use when you got to it.
Yes.
Now, I think you deal with that, and I needn't take you back there at page 235, and then you go on to 236 to talk again about Zutec, and then we then touch on CAFM.
Yes.
So just help us to understand what CAFM was supposed to be.
Well, that's a computer-aided facilities management software package.
So that's not just a register of documents.
No, the idea of that is that all the processes and the PPM work schedules, etc., that are required to manage the building would be programmed into the system, and it would be scheduled in the system, and that schedule would be adaptable to meet the resources available from the estates team. So, for example, if we had 200 ppm that were due to be carried out next week, and we only had 10 staff, we could reorganise that so that we could have enough work for 10 staff, and then the rest would be rescheduled for the following week automatically, or for a suitable time period automatically. That's not the way it worked in Zootech at all.
Well, let me just go back one step, just so we're clear. We probably all know what it is, but I'll just check. PPM is planned preventative maintenance.
Correct.
Is it, from an estate's perspective, is that an important part of your job?
Yes, that's the maintenance programme that would be carried out on any item to make sure it was still performing correctly, that there was no faults on it, that it was safe. Now that didn't need any consumables replaced, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So you couldn't use Zootech to do this process?
Zootech, according to Multiplex, Zootech had a PPM system installed on it, but what it was in reality was a list of tasks. So there would maybe be, say, a number of jobs put in as PPMs, and each job would have a schedule of items that needed to be addressed based on manufacturer recommendations. But there was no way to, other than manually print it out, but there was no way to schedule that or program it or feed it back to verify it had been complete. It just wasn't a working system. It was just like a document, a register of documents.
I think I've picked up a distinction between a dynamic digital program and, I don't know what the opposite is, but let's say static.
Yes.
And Zootech is a static system. In other words, it holds information as at a particular moment of time.
Yes.
But it's not designed to take in more information or manipulate that information in any way.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that the idea of a CAFM system is that a lot of it happens within the system itself, and it will come out and say you have to do X or Y today or
Yes.
next week or whenever it is.
Yes.
I'm oversimplifying, but
yeah, you still need someone to manage that and put the right information in to get the right information out. But basically, it performs a lot more tasks, and it links into other facilities type software to allow you to perform other tasks.
now, I think I'm right in saying that the actual system, the actual CAFM system was the board system, but what the contractor was meant to do was to put all the necessary material onto that system.
Yes. At the time of contract, and that was one of the issues that Brian Gillespie and I had fed into the outline design spec. At that time, we had just emitted from trusts back to a board, and we were looking to harmonise the CAFM systems across all the sites. And at the time the contract was being put together, we hadn't done that yet, but we had two systems identified that we were possibly going to adopt, and we had named those. And the contract required Multiplex to adopt the preferred system and populate it with the PPM and asset tag data for the Queen Elizabeth as it was handed over. And from there, provide the hardware that was required to run that. So that would be like barcode, QR code readers, that kind of thing, to allow us to automate the process so that where an asset tag was applied, it would have a code on it, and we'd be able to verify that asset was the right asset that we were going to work on. That was all part and parcel of the contract.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you two questions. If you don't have a fully populated facilities management system, does it make your job as estates manager more difficult?
Makes it pretty impossible, yeah.
Pretty impossible in what way?
And the fact that we then have to manually process all the PPM, and in fact, That's if we appreciate what all the PPM is, because we might not be aware of items of plant that require servicing, etc. And therefore, it's nigh impossible to retrospectively, without a dedicated team to develop it, to retrospectively go back and identify all the requirements.
Well, you deal with some of this in your statement. Can I just ask you generally, how long was it, can you remember, until you actually had an operational facilities management system of the kind that you thought you were supposed to have?
I don't believe that was in place by the time I retired. It was being worked on, and we had done a lot of work to convert the information that was provided by Multiplex onto a platform that could be migrated into the CAFM system. But equally, the PPM that was developed along with that by Multiplex didn't take into account all the aspects that were required. Again, the contract required that the PPM should cover manufacturer's recommendations, mandatory and statutory requirements. Multiplex had only provided manufacturer's recommended PPM, so the mandatory and statutory PPM wasn't there. So from the board's point of view, we were looking at adopting a system called SFG 20, which was an industry standard PPM system that gave you the ability to take into account all three elements.
Thank you. I apologise in advance, Mr. Powrie, if my questions jump around a bit, but it's just the way they're laid out in your statement, and the easiest thing to do is to take that order. In January 2015, when the first handover took place of the site, what was the state of the children's hospital?
It was incomplete. There was still construction works outstanding within the building. I think there was construction breaches between the children's and the theatre suite. Ventilation wasn't complete. It was still a construction site in effect.
Now, this point is maybe fairly obvious, but on 238, which is 31 of the original numbering, you explain another task that fell to the estates team, which involved about 200 plus, let's just call them multiplex people, because it doesn't matter whether they're multiplex or subcontractors or whoever, turning up and having to be, their interaction with the building having to be managed by you.
Yes.
By you and your team.
So in effect, what we had to do there is we had to have an access register and ID badge system, so that we knew who was authorised to be on site and who wasn't. For each task that the contractors were coming back on site to do, we had to review the method statements and risk assessments and approve those, or go back and ask for clarifications or reworking to suit our requirements. In effect, we became the building owners and responsible for the activity on the site. So contractors had to be vetted and processed by our team.
I see. Thank you. Let me turn on to another topic, if I can, because it comes next in the order of your statement. 239. You're asked about commissioning of the water system and commissioning and validation of the ventilation system and what you saw at the point of handover. And you make the point that you couldn't see anything for a couple of months because Zutec wasn't available. Did you see commissioning and validation reports at that stage?
I've seen parts of them. To be honest, I couldn't tell whether they were commissioning data or validation data. It was all classed as commissioning. There was no distinction. So for water, for example, I saw some records of the sanitation process. In fact, I had advised that the sanitation process in principle should be approved prior to being carried out by the infection control doctor.
Is that the point you make at the foot of 239? Of your statement, that's Professor Williams at the time.
Yes. So, yeah, Professor Williams was the lead infection control manager for the department, and he was actually working with the project team on the new build compliance for infection control. So I got the proposed methodology for sanitisation of the water system, shared it with Professor Williams, who approved that. So in principle, once he's approved that, he should also then witness the testing as well. I don't know that he did do that, but he did sanction the test protocol. And then all the test results were shared with Professor Williams and their iterations, because some of them were out with the required limits and had to be resanitised and retested to the point where Professor Williams was satisfied that the system was deemed fit for use.
Thank you.
Mr. Powrie, can you help me on this? You've been referred to the bottom of 239. Where does the requirement for a disinfection method statement, and if I've followed what you've said, the results of testing come from?
That would be the SHTM, I think it's 03 for water.
04,
04,
possibly.
sorry.
Right. So the source of that obligation is SHTM 04.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
And on the next page, you've been asked about, well, what's the difference between commissioning and validation? And you're quoting, I think, on that page from SHTM 0301
Yes.
about ventilation. And you set out there what I think is a quotation directly from the document.
It is.
When you say that the system will be acceptable to the client if at the time of the validation it's considered fit for purpose and only requires routine maintenance. Who does the validation?
Well, the validation should be an independent specialist contractor who validates all the components of the system are working together as they should.
And would report to what? To the board?
Well, ultimately the board would need the results, but I think in this case the validation should have been carried out by Multiplex and approved by the board.
Approved by the board.
Sorry.
I maybe didn't hear the answer. You we're talking about ventilation at the moment, and you draw attention to the provisions of SHTM 0301, and that has a requirement for, as you said, independent validation. Yes. Now, validation by Multiplex doesn't sound to me independent.
Well, independent.
With great respect to Multiplex.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think independent would be independent of the contractors that installed. Yes. So that, bear in mind, that's subcontractors to Multiplex. So the contractors that would be validating would be independent to them.
Would be
independent to the people that installed the ventilation itself.
I would assume independent both of the subcontractor and the contractor.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that, and I wouldn't say that was wrong, but it wasn't the way it worked in this case.
Right. You may have answered this question. Were you aware whether validation had been carried out?
I wasn't aware of independent validation, no.
Thank you.
And I think you perhaps touch on that on page 241, original page 34, where in an answer you say, well, I didn't see validation data at handover because of the population issue of Zutec. I didn't see it later. You'd assumed that it had been done and accepted as fit for purpose in order for the board to accept handover.
Yes.
That the point of validation, that it's to allow the client to say, yes, I can take this.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I only have one question to you about the training regime, because you've made quite a lot of comments that we can read in due course in your statement about training and whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, and distinction between familiarization and technical training.
Yes.
But was there an issue about people having enough time to attend training, given what
Yes.
else was going on?
Yes, the training was run in tandem with the handover and the commissioning, the operational commissioning period. So while we were busy dealing with that, the training was also being delivered at the same time. In addition to that, because we didn't have a full complement of staff on site, we had difficulties getting staff released from other campuses to come and take part in the training. We did get some, but it wasn't the numbers that we would have liked to have been involved in that programme.
And presumably the people that were on site might have had other things to do other than attend
Yeah, well,
training.
the people on site, the people that are part of my team, bear in mind it's a team of 6, including myself. We were that busy doing all these other issues that we didn't always get time to go to these sessions. We tried to make sure there was always 1 or 2 people did get to go, so there was at least some knowledge, but we didn't always manage to do that.
Now, another, apologies again if these seem slightly random question, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. At one point in your statement, you were asked about, well, what were you not happy with it? Handover, and you say things like, well, the Children's Hospital was still a building site, and you make some comments about the CHP plant, which is another issue which we needn't go into. But you added a comment on 250, original page 43 at the top. This is, I think, just after you've discussed the CHP plant and the fact that you were concerned that it was having an impact, or the energy system was having an impact on the ability to use temperature to disinfect. And then you make a comment about, that dosing you're talking about there at the top of the page, due to the complexity of the domestic systems, water treatment should have been included. Is that dosing in the system with something?
I don't know if I'm on the same page here.
Oh, sorry, 250 at the top of the page. The first full paragraph, I believe that due to the size. Have you got that?
Yes, I have.
Thank you.
Water treatment plant, yeah, dosing, yeah, it'd be the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, and why did you think that dosing should have been part of the system?
Well, there's the system is so large and complex that it was always going to have challenges in terms of keeping the whole system at an equilibrium, if I can say the word right, temperature across the system, because it was multiple heat stations, etc. And the SHTM guidance suggests that if the system is filled earlier than occupation, then it should be considered for water treatment to keep the system in an acceptable condition. The system was filled 9 months before occupation, and although there was flushing programs in place and as per guidance to maintain the water flow rates and keep the water fresh, the dosing system would have actually absolutely meant that the system was kept clean.
We're probably jumping ahead a little bit, so we'll no doubt trip up over this later on.
Okay.
But the filling 9 months ahead of occupation, was that before the filters were in place that otherwise filter all incoming supplies?
I believe it was. I didn't know that at the time, but I found later on that the system had been filled without the filters, yeah.
Right. Okay. So you have the system filled about 9 months before occupation, before the filters are in place. And did that concern you?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of why I feel that there should have been the treatment system in place as well.
Thank you. Now, on the same page, 250, moving to the second half of the page, this is a topic we're going to come back to a little later on. But you're talking there about, I suppose the key may be in the phraseology, a pre-occupancy water risk assessment.
Yes,
Now, am I right in thinking that that means it should be done pre-occupancy,
yes.
you know, before it's the building's handed over?
Well, pre-occupancy before it's occupied by patients.
Right. And you thought that should have been done by Multiplex?
Yes, I'm sure it was a contract requirement that they provide the pre-occupancy risk assessment.
Yeah. And did you raise that with, is it Mr. Loudon?
I did, but I think I raised it at one of the project meetings.
And what did he do about it?
I think at the next meeting he came back, I'm assuming after consulting with Multiplex, and he instructed me to have the pre-occupancy risk assessment carried out.
And that's also something that's sometimes called the L8
Yes,
assessment.
yes,
And it's focused on, well, it's said to be focused on Legionella primarily.
yes. It's a Legionella avoidance document.
Thank you. And that, I think, is probably your first involvement with that particular topic. You
Yes.
think it should have been done, you raise it, and you're told ultimately go and get it done.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just jumping forward again to 254, original page 47. I don't know whether I need to dig out the document for you, but that was an email by somebody called Francis Rath.
Yep, and Francis was one of the project managers.
She was a project manager.
Yeah.
Which stated that all areas had been commissioned in line with employers' requirements. Did
Yes.
you agree with that statement?
I don't. I think that now again at that time I might have agreed, but because I think what that statement does is it indicates that the project team believed that that's what they understood had been delivered. Obviously, retrospectively, I don't agree with it because of the issues that we've found since.
Thank you very much. Well, just for the notes, I'm not going to bring that document up, but that document is to be found in bundle 12 at page 936. Trying to save a little bit time by not going to the documents every
Yes.
time, Mr. Powrie. Then in the next stage of your statement, you're asked about various wards, what was in place, and so on and so forth. And then we come back to the topic of what I've been calling paperwork in my old-fashioned way, but in this case, the topic of asset tagging.
Yes.
And you start to deal with asset tagging on 257, old number 50. Now, tell us what asset tagging is. We've
Well,
probably touched on it very briefly, but not in any
Yeah.
detail.
Asset tagging is identifying each item with its unique reference that's recorded on the CAFM system. So each item's got a reference, usually made up of a combination of codes: site code, block code, level code, department code, or plant room code, whatever. And then a unique number for that item. So that asset code then is tied to the plant or the item that it represents in the CAFM system and allows you to keep records on its maintenance, and now it's manufacturer's documentation, compliance issues can all be kept in a discrete.
So just so I'm understanding this, if you had, I don't know, I'll invent an example. Say a fan, which is part of an air handling unit.
Yes,
Would it have an asset?
that would tend to be a sub-asset of the
Sub-asset.
air handling unit as an
Right.
asset. Yes.
So there'd be a tag for the air handling unit?
Yes.
I see. And I think you say on 257 that the whole point of this is so you can work your planned maintenance.
Yes.
And does it tell you where this asset is?
That would be that's the reason for the coding. It tells you what building it's in, what level it's on, what floor, what site it's on, that kind of thing. So, because that should be a subsection within the Greater Glasgow Asset Register for the whole organisation.
And if things are not asset tagged, what impact does it have on PPM?
Well, you've then got to start looking for serial numbers and cross-referencing to make sure that the item of plant that you're attending is the correct item of plant for that planned preventive maintenance, etc.
So when you came on to take occupation, that point where the board becomes responsible for the building, had asset tagging happened?
No,
When did it eventually get done?
I think it was towards the end of the contract warranty period, so that would be, 2017?
So did that impact on what your team could do between 2015 and the date in 2017?
Yeah, I mean, it was part and parcel of the whole issue that we didn't have an operational CAFM system, so the whole failure to deliver that system impacted on ability to carry out PPM.
My fault. Part of the whole problem didn't have an operational, and then I didn't catch.
Sorry, CAFM, the CAFM system, CAFM.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
And this is again connected to the other acronym we've been using, which is PPM.
Yes.
So if you don't know where the assets are because the tagging hasn't happened yet and CAFM isn't populated, you can't do PPM in the way that
No,
you're supposed to do.
it would take a lot longer because you've then got to decipher where everything is and check serial numbers, locations. It makes the whole thing more difficult.
Thank you. And in fact, you deal with a number of these problems and how they impacted in detail on a series of pages in your statement that follow the one we've just looked at. And I'm not going to trouble you to read your way through all of that. So let's leave asset tagging as another paperwork issue and perhaps move on. So you were asked a number of questions about HEPA filters. You know what a HEPA filter is?
Yes.
I assume. And there seemed to have, a slightly peculiar situation where there was space for a HEPA filter, but there were no HEPA filters in one of the level 2 wards. Is that right?
I thought it was wider than that. There's, I think, 36 isolation rooms. None of them had HEPA filters installed. Now, the difference with Ward 2A is that Ward 2A isolation rooms were designed to accommodate neutropenic patients. So they should have had HEPA filters fitted in them because it was for a known patient group. The other rooms were in areas where it could be for protective isolation or source isolation. So there was no way to know whether you needed a HEPA filter in that situation. So I raised the issue about the filters being missing, and Multiplex told me that these were a user-defined requirement, and it was up to the client to install these where required. I disputed that because this Ward 2A should have been designed for that patient group, therefore the filter should have been there as part of commissioning. That was escalated through David Loudon, and David picked that up with Alistair Fernie from Multiplex, and they obviously must have agreed that because Multiplex then sourced some filters from Ireland. I believe they had a project and they were able to procure those filters from that project to bring over to Glasgow, and the filters were then fitted in Ward 2A. So that's the only ward that they should have been, now as per contract, should have been fitted in as part of commissioning.
Could I just take you over that so that I followed that? at handover in the Children's Hospital, there were 36, as it were, holes waiting for HEPA filters.
Sorry, can I just clarify that? There were 30.
Please do.
Yeah, 36 isolation rooms across the adults and children's.
Right.
There weren't, I think, in the children's, there was maybe 20.
Right.
The rest were in adults.
Okay. So we're talking about isolation, designated isolation rooms, and that would include the rooms in 2A.
Yes.
Right. And the requirement for HEPA filtration, again, is, well, a source of requiring HEPA filtration is SHTM 0301.
Yes.
Right.
Or in this case, it was SHPN 4 supplement 1, because that's what the rooms were designed to.
Right. Right. And the issue with multiplex, if I followed you, was that that may be, but we had no contractual obligation to fit a filter. That was something for the client.
That was their position
That was
when I
it.
raised the question at first, Jesse.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I won't ask you any more about HEPA filters. You'll be pleased to know, Mr. Powrie. Let's move on to another topic, another exciting topic, chilled beams. Starts to be dealt with in your statement at 267, original page 60. And you start there, I think, by setting out your personal view of using chilled beams in areas where there are immune compromised patients.
Yes.
Which you quite fairly say is based on your experience of things that happened at the hospital. And you list a number of reasons for your unhappiness with the idea, air changes, risk of condensation, dust particles being drawn into the system, and maintenance. Now, you're then asked, I think, about any individual issues that you remember cropping up, and you go on to tell us about a difficulty over the dew point controls.
Yes.
that cropped up. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this, but what was the issue about dew point controls?
Right. Well, the first experience we had was it was summer, very warm outside. So when the air outside is warm, it holds more moisture. When it comes in, it gets processed through the ventilation plant, and it hits. It hits cool surfaces. That moisture condensates and creates condensation. When that's brought into the ward level itself, and that moisture hits a chill beam, which is at low temperature, I think from memory the temperatures for the chill beams was about 14 degrees. So that then condensates on these cooling batteries in the chill beam, and that condensation drips off the battery onto the chill beam housing and then through the perforations into the room itself. So on that occasion, it was happening in multiple wards across the site. So that led to the requirement for a rapid response for clean-up and sanitisation of the areas affected. On top of that, the condensation was black because there had been a layer of dust build up on the ventilation cooling battery. And that dust was turning the water black, so it looked as if it was a high risk for infection.
And is there supposed to be some way of stopping this happening?
Yes, the HTM or SHTM says where chill beams are being used, they tried to allow for innovation in design, so chill beams are not ruled out, but where they are being used, they should be fitted with dew point control sensors. And what that does is once the temperature of the chill beam is basically at the point where the air would condensate on the temperature of the chill beam, it shuts the chill beam off to avoid the condensation event. That wasn't installed on our system, although it's an HTM or SHTM requirement. There was a reason given for that, and that reason was that we experienced problems of dew point shutdown in the lab building when it was handed over, and it was causing excessive temperatures in the labs. So that was raised as a concern with multiplex as to its impact when we went into the hospital. I hadn't been aware that they had designed the dew point control out totally as a result of that, and therefore we ended up with this problem as a result.
Right, let me just make sure I can follow that. SHTM 0301, which you, in fairness to you, you quote on page 268, about halfway down, basically says there needs to be controls to deal with this issue of dew point.
Yes.
And that's what the guidance anticipates. And what happens is you call out the engineer, he looks at the control box and discovers there's no dew point control.
Yes.
So you go and try to find out what's happened, and you eventually discover, and this is dealt with at 269, large letter A near the top, that actually the dew point controls had been taken out, whatever SHTM 0301 says.
Yes.
And were you then charged with trying to sort this out?
Yes, however that came about contractually, whether how it was agreed, I don't know, but I was then asked to look at what other options can we do to address this. So I worked with Schneider Controls, who had installed the controls for the campus, to develop a proposal. I then nominated Paul McAllister, I think it was, to work with Schneider to thrash out the detail of that proposal and make it a workable design, and then got approval from David Loudon to spend the money to implement that proposal. So basically the proposal was that rather than go back in and try and reintroduce the dew point control on every chiller battery or chill beam, that we would do a central dew point control for each of the distinct loops of chilled water. And as basically we put a control on there that says when the temperature reaches dew point, shut the chilled water circuit off to avoid condensation across the site. So we did that on, I think there was about 9 different zones that had their individual controls to avoid further condensation events.
And was that successful?
To my knowledge, when I retired, there had been no further condensation issues. I don't know if there's been any since, but 2019 it had been successful up until then.
So this is, I think we've heard, the inquiry's heard from other witnesses about water dripping down from the chilled beams.
I think that might be different issues. I don't think it's condensation. One of the issues that I've seen in the bundle was relating to a leaking coupling.
Relating to, sorry, I missed that.
A leaking coupling.
All right, okay.
So back to what we're talking about, the push fit connectors. The new couplings were compression fittings. That means that you tighten them up against a seal, and they're mechanically sealed after that. So I think the issues you're referring to might be relating to where these have failed, and I believe that some of them have failed due to, again, after I retired, but I believe some of them have failed due to temperature fluctuations, due to failures of the boiler plant. The temperature dropped down, come back up again, and the coupling mechanical seal has failed because of expansion and contraction.
Thank you. And obviously, when you were discovering this issue, and you were saying that some of the droplets that were coming down were picking up muck,
Dust, yeah.
dust from part of the system and therefore appearing as black.
Yes.
Did that also mean that you had to look at organising how these would be cleaned?
Yes. I looked at the manufacturer's recommendations for cleaning, and the manufacturer's saying, depending on the environment, they should only require to be cleaned every 5 years. And given that we were in a clinical environment, which in fact is clean, you would expect that to be the case. However, what we were finding was that these chill beams also had an induction component. What that means is that they draw some air in from the room and they mix that with the supply fresh air and then reintroduce it to the room again. I can't remember the proportion, but in effect what that means is that air that's been inducted back into the chill beam is drawing fibres in with it from the room environment, and those fibres are settling on the coil, and that's building up a layer of material that then created this black condensation.
Can I take an advantage with this moment to improve my understanding? Am I right in thinking that chilled beams may be active or passive?
Yes.
And what we're talking about are passive chilled beams. Am I right about that?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Right, yeah. Sorry, Mr. Connell.
But the point you were discussing was the fact that under the system they operated, a proportion of the air that went through the chilling process was taken from the room.
Yes.
And thus brought with it, somebody had been vigorously shaking the bedding or whatever it was.
It's quite common to get fibres from the bedding, or where you've got surgical packs, where it's a blue kind of paper. The fibres come off of that quite readily and can be entrained in the air as well.
Yeah. Oh, I just have one more question on chill beams, you'll be pleased to know. On page 271 of your statement, original 64, near the top, at the bottom of a small paragraph with a small j, you say that there was some testing done of samples within 2A.
Yes.
And your understanding is that the build-up was inert.
Yes.
Is that correct? Because I think
that was
it
my
might be
understanding.
suggested to you that it wasn't inert.
But I'd never heard of that. The samples were taken and passed over to Trees Inkster, and the feedback I got at that time was the samples were inert. I haven't ever been told anything different than that.
Okay, thank you. The next topic that crops up is on the next page, 272. I want to just ask, first of all, a question that's not covered in your statement. Thermal wheels, do you know whether they were in one location in the hospital or many locations?
I think they were pretty much in all locations. I think it was a standard design feature of the ventilation.
Do you know if there is a record of where all these thermal wheels are?
There will be in relation to the detail of each air handling unit plant, but I don't know if there's a concise record.
I think it was suggested in the course of some other evidence we've heard that there was some kind of Excel spreadsheet which sort of set it all out where all the thermal wheels were. Is that anything you know about?
No, that might have been after 2019.
Thank you. You pick up thermal wheels, and I'm conscious of the time. I won't spend long on this. On 272, original page 65, and you express your view about the use of thermal wheels, I think, on the next page, 273, in the context of the housing of immunocompromised patients.
Yes.
And then there's a discussion there about, is it a small risk or should you eliminate that small risk effectively? Is that right?
Yes. So the inclusion of a purge section within the thermal wheel is meant to eliminate that risk. but you've still got the potential for what they call bypass of the thermal wheel. So the thermal wheel's in a housing and it's sealed in that housing with a running seal. It's a big wheel driven by a belt. So there's a seal around that that's like a brush that contacts the external side of the wheel. That can have bypass on it, so air from the downstream can bypass the thermal wheel itself and go round through these, what do you call them, seals. Equally, I don't know that the purge sections are 100% effective. And when I discussed this with the manufacturer, they had advised that if they'd known they were going into an environment where it was immunocompromised patients, they wouldn't have recommended thermal wheels be installed.
Sorry, could you just give me that last two
Sure.
sentences again?
So the manufacturer, I think it was a company called Barkel. And when I discussed, well, I was working with Matthew Lambert at the time, and we were both communicating with the manufacturer, and we both get the same feedback. If they had been made aware that thermal wheels were to be used in air handling units supplying neutropenic or immunocompromised patient areas, they would have recommended not to install them.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Just so we have a reference for that, I think you have touched on that in your statement already. 273 at large A near the top. You say that recommendations from the designer manufacturers to further protect immune-compromised patient facilities by not employing thermal wheels. Is that the discussion you've just talked to His Lordship about?
Yes.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I'm conscious of the time now. Moving on is something I've been trying to do, but I would be doing it again. So if it's convenient, this might be the time to take a break.
Right, well, we're now at, I think, 1:30. As I said, we usually take a break in mid-morning. Could I ask you to be back for 10 to 12?
Yeah, no problem. Yep. Thank you.
Be taken to the witness room.
Please stand. Thank you, my lord.
Mr. Connell.
Mr. Powrie, welcome back. I've been asked to raise a question with you. It's not covered in your statement. It's just a single question, and if you don't know the answer, please say so. We've heard a bit this morning in the course of other evidence about what the contractor should or shouldn't have done and so on. Was there a person or body, to your knowledge, charged with, as it were, supervising the compliance by the contractor with their obligations?
My understanding would be that would have been Capita,
Right.
who were meant to ensure that the contract was meeting the contractual requirements.
Thank you. Now, returning to your statement, you deal with a number of issues about the CHP plant, which I don't intend to take you to. Sorry, Mark.
Right. Just reflecting on the question and answer. The question was who was supervising the contractors meeting their obligations, and quite understandably, the answer to that was Capita was on behalf of GDC checking on contractual obligations, as one would expect. I don't know if you want to take that anywhere.
It's simply, I've been asked, my lord, to see if this witness could identify.
Okay.
Was there somebody or somebody, some individual or somebody which had the general role of trying to make sure that the contractor fulfilled their contractual obligations to do this, that, or the next thing? And Mr. Powrie has given me the answer. For various reasons, including the fact it's probably not a central issue for Glasgow 3, I'm not proposing to pursue this further at this time. So I was just saying, Mr. Powrie, that I'm kind of skipping past some CHP stuff and stuff about water temperatures, because you really gave us that evidence earlier. And we may find as we go through your statement that we trip up over bits that, for one reason or another, we've already taken from you. So please accept my apologies. I'm going into a section now that starts with page 289, original 82, where we're dealing about water guidance. Just so we get some explanation and background, you'd been a designated post holder for water in one of your previous roles, so you were able to respond to lots of the questions about what there should be in place and so on. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But you've already told us you weren't involved in the contractual commissioning or anything of the water system.
No.
And did you have some knowledge about the necessity to have systems in place focused on Legionella?
Yes.
You touch on this on page 292, original 85. And you're asked there about Legionella training presumably for staff at the hospital. And you say that there wasn't any until 2018.
Yes.
Why was that? Do you know?
Well, as part of the maintenance strategy that we spoke about earlier, I had developed a training matrix highlighting all the training requirements for mainly managers and supervisors. And Legionella training was one of those for the people that were going to be involved in water management. After handover of the building, the post of Estates General Manager was implemented, and before that I had this training programme. I'd started carrying out some of the training in relation to high voltage for authorised persons because of the nature of the high voltage network controlling site, and any response to that in an emergency required an authorised person. So I'd already delivered the training on that. The next stage was to deliver training on the water management, Legionella, etc. However, in between times, the new general manager was appointed, and
That's Mr. Alan Gallagher.
that's correct.
Yeah.
And they developed a compliance team. Tommy Romeo, due to staff changes, was brought in to be the AP nominated. And Tommy raised with me the fact that he hadn't been trained and that he would do what he could, but he hadn't the training behind him. So I raised
The
that.
note, sorry to interrupt, Mr. Powrie, the note that I have says that there wasn't a compliance team until late 2016.
Well, that would be in line with this. Alan told me that he was putting in place a compliance team, and that the compliance team would develop training programme, and that the relevant personnel would be trained in line with that once it had been developed. So that's as far as the training went at that time.
Thank you. And that's dealt with on, as I say, on page 292, original 85 in the middle of the page. And then over the page 293, original 86, we find there discussion of the question of different people holding different posts relating to water and how they had to be appointed.
Yes.
And you say that you understood that needed to be done and you'd taken at least initial steps towards doing that. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd taken in relation to discussions with DMA. I had written out a schedule of the nominated personnel that would fulfil these roles for recording in the water risk assessment and the written scheme, and I forwarded that on to Mary Ann Kane and asked her to verify that these would indeed be the post holders, and asked her about appointments. Mary Ann said she would take that to the Infection Control Committee and would get back to me with validation or verification of that.
Was that in 2015 sometime? Do you remember?
Yes, it would be, because it was following on from the initial discussions about the water risk assessment.
Thank you. And you said you'd given these to Mary Ann Kane. Did she get back to you on it?
I don't recall her ever coming back and giving, there certainly wasn't any appointments, and I don't recall her coming back to, she verbally verified that these were the right names, but she wanted to validate that from the Infection Control Committee. I don't remember ever coming back to confirm.
So that the net result at that point was that there were not in place duly appointed holders of any of these posts?
Correct.
Authorised person and so on?
Yeah.
What about an authorised engineer for water?
Authorised engineer, at the start of the programme, I don't think that we had an authorised engineer. The one was appointed. I don't know the ins and outs because I wasn't involved in the appointment, but one was appointed, and I think that was 2015, but I couldn't pin a date to that.
You can't put a date on that. Thank you very much. I just want to ask you about, we don't get very many moments of light relief in these sessions, perhaps for understandable reasons. But I just want to ask you about something you say on 294, original 87 of your statement, where you've already told us you weren't aware of the commissioning of the water system, and you weren't invited, you say, about halfway down the page there. And then there's a comment here about you were told that Multiplex would be quite happy if you didn't come to meetings because you cost them money.
Yeah, this was third hand, obviously, from Mary Ann in a discussion, and she had said to me that David Loudon had told her that he had been asked to hold me at arm's length from the project because every time I got involved, it was costing money.
Thank you. So we move on to 296. We already, I think, identified what L8 is. It's the Legionella supposedly preoccupation water assessment. Right?
Well, L8's the HSE guidance
Right,
on
sorry.
the control and management of Legionella, but it's a guidance document used for all of these on top of the new HSG documents as well.
And earlier in your evidence, you'd explained that there wasn't a preoccupation one. You'd asked David Loudon about it, and he'd come back to you and said, well, you get on and instruct one.
Yes.
And I think you're telling us at the foot of 296 that you did instruct one, and that would be with DMA Canyon.
That's correct.
And purely practical question. You say when you got it from them, did you get it from them electronically or in hard copy?
It was hard copy. We had a meeting to review and they gave us hard copies, but I think they also sent electronic copies.
Thank you. Yeah, so you say at the foot of 296 you had a meeting with DMA David Bratty and Jim Guthrie.
Yes.
And you sent Mr. Bratty and Mr. Guthrie off to work with DMA, is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, on the next page, we come back to this question of filling of the water, and you've given us the dates for that and whether it was in advance of the filtration and so on already in your evidence. So I don't think I need go back to that. There's perhaps a little issue that you deal with, which I'm not sure we've come across before on 298, which is a reverse osmosis filtration.
Yes.
What earth's that?
It's a type of filter that they use for the renal dialysis process. So the water that goes through the dialysis machines has got to be pure because it's potentially coming into contact with recirculated blood. So the reverse osmosis machine filters that to the level of quality required for the dialysis process.
Right. And the issue that you're discussing at the top of 298 is the fact that the reverse osmosis line had to be taken out of operation to be sanitized from time to time, and there wasn't a backup. Is that right?
Yes, that's an automatic process that happens every 24 to 48 hours. And the reverse osmosis plant shuts down and a heat sanitation process is carried out on the pipework. It's not so much for the filter itself, it's for the distribution pipework for the renal service. So that's heat sanitized as part of that system, and it's an automatic process. The issue, sorry.
No, please carry on. You're about to tell me what the issue was.
The issue was that while that's happening, it takes several hours to complete. If they've got an emergency, it happens out of hours normally. So if there's an emergency renal patient that needs dialysed, then they don't have a source of renal water to do that. So the project team, in consultation with the clinical department, can it put on six renal connection points onto the potable water system. Potable water being drinking water. And then the machines that would be connected to that would have miniature filtration plant on them to allow them to use that water for the dialysing process. So that was okay for what they needed, but then it created a risk in terms of the potable water because these would be seldom used outlets and they'd be required to be added into a flushing regime and management regime.
Right. So you're creating outlets that are only going to be used in an emergency, which may have water in them, and therefore they're in that box of things you need to remember the water is just sitting there
Yes.
and deal with that.
I mean, they were engineered so that there was only a short tail from the water loop to the machine connection, but it was still a perceived risk.
And you tried to suggest a solution, I think.
Yes.
And what was that solution?
Solution was to put in another loop so that it was a standby loop feeding a reduced number of points, but that would be in operation while the main loop was being sanitised, and then the emergency loop would be sanitised independently of that at a different time.
So that at all times there would be water which had been subject to this reverse osmosis available either by the main loop or the standby loop.
That's correct.
And I think you tried to get that done and you were told there was no money.
Well, I put in a capital application for funding to have that carried out, but competing against other projects that maybe had higher priority, there was no funding made available.
And in the next paragraph, you're asked, well, what's the trouble with potable water? And you say, well, it's safe to drink, but you have to then, as you told us, treat these outlets as seldom used ones and subject them to flushing.
Yes.
I've been asked to ask you, does that mean that they are also treated with biocides?
If the system is treated, I mean, at that time we weren't treating it with biocides, but there is a chloramine treatment that's carried out by Scottish Water, and that could still be active on site as it comes through our system. So there is a risk that chloramines are fed through those systems. That's dealt with at the reverse osmosis plant by the installation of carbon filters. And if we don't look after the renal equipment, that's clinical physics that look after that. So clinical physics would have a mini filtration unit attached to a machine if it used on a potable water system, and it would have its own mini RO unit and carbon filter to deal with that.
Thank you. And I think in the next section, you deal with a topic that almost by accident we covered earlier, which was the filling of the overall water system about 9 months, you later discovered, before handover.
Yes.
Which is at the foot of 298, original 91. And you tried to find out why it was, and you were told why it was, and you said, well, should we not treat it? Mm-hmm. And you were told no. Yeah.
Well, the feedback on that was that the SHTM guidance said that was an admission the system wasn't engineered properly, and this was a modern, compliant engineered system. That was the gist of the feedback.
Yeah. I think somewhere in your statement, I will just touch on it now since you've raised it, you quote from SHTM 0401, where there's a statement, I think that's what you're referring to, which says, in effect, if you chemically dose, that's an admission that between the system and its maintenance, you're not able to keep it
it's not
to the standard you need. Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, this is just a point of detail rather than a substantive topic I want to deal with. Can I just take you to the foot of 300, original 93, please? You were asked there about pre-occupation water tests, and you said, yes, there were some. And you then said, well, where would we find them? And you've given an answer to that. Do you know whether any of them were out of specification?
Is this pre-handover or post-handover?
Yep, this is pre-occupation.
Pre-occupation. Well, that could still be, if it was during the operational commissioning period, there were some that were out of spec, yes, but these were sanitised and retested and were clear. I couldn't give you details. I can't remember how many or how often, but that was part of the process of preparing the system for handover, for occupation. was to make sure that as each ward was occupied, it had been tested, sanitised and tested again to make sure that it was of suitable quality.
Thank you. Another point of detail, please, at the foot of 302, original 95. Point is being put to you that there were positive Legionella results in Ward 2A in June 2015, and the assertion is that you'd said, well, I don't want to put anything in writing. Do you have any recollection of that?
Me personally?
Yeah, saying that.
No.
Do you remember these results at all?
I don't remember Christine raising any issues about Legionella positive results. I don't have any recollection of that at all.
On 303, which is effectively the next point, original 96, paragraph headed 99, you're asked whether Christine Peters asked you for the risk assessment for waterborne infection, and did you give her it?
I don't remember Dr. Peters asking me for that directly, and if she asked the project team or Mary-Ann Kane, they didn't pass that on to me, so I didn't share it at that time, no.
Thank you. Can we just move on, please, to another heading starts at least on 306, original 99, headed Water System General. And you've been asked there about testing and maintenance protocols and regimes and what was being done about that. And are you saying that's something that Mr. Bratty and others were dealing with?
Yes.
And that the meeting that you talk about in paragraph 109 with Mr. Bratty and Mr. Guthrie, and originally you'd thought Mr. McMillan, but he couldn't make it. Is that the same meeting that you've referred to a little earlier on?
Yes, it is.
Once the DMA assessment came in?
Yes.
Thank you. Again, a point of detail, if I may, I've been asked to raise with you, page 100, 307, original 100, at the foot. You were asked about any concerns about testing and stagnant water in the system, and you explained that Mr. Guthrie was managing various testing and sanitation processes, and you said that concerns over stagnation were highlighted by DMA, and your expectation was that Mr. Bratty and Mr. Guthrie would deal with these. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you yourself, leaving aside what Mr. Bratty and Mr. Guthrie might do, did you raise that issue with infection control at all?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Now I'll now be able to check my ability to quote correctly from SHTM 0401, because on page 308, original 101, we find further reference to the water system being filled, and to your argument that there should have been dosing because of that, and because your view is that that's needed generally. And then there's a quotation in the middle of that page from SHTM 0401, Part A, Roman 5.1, Section 15.1, saying the introduction of chemical treatment is an admission that the physical installation and or the management process is incapable of maintaining that water supply in a wholesome condition.
Yes.
Now, just while we're talking about dosing, because we know a matter we haven't got round to yet, that ultimately dosing was applied.
Yes.
In the hospital. I mean, is it normal to have a major building like this with a constant dosing system? Do you know?
I think it's more common than it was. I mean, there's other sites in both at the Queen Elizabeth campus and in other sites in Glasgow where there's water treatment in place as a standard. But they've been installed due to water maintenance issues. So it's not uncommon. I think the new build scenario is restricted by that statement in terms of whether they're installed in new builds or not. But I think there's also other statements in SHTM that say that you should consider installing water treatment if you fill the water system early or it's a large complex system, that kind of thing.
Thank you. And if you don't know the answer to this question, please just tell me, are there any other impacts other than killing off bugs that are caused by dosing?
Yes, well, if you're looking at chlorine dioxide, which is the preferred product, there's limitations on the level and concentration of chlorine dioxide that can be discharged at the point of use. So that's the tap for consumption. That's limited to 0.5 ppm maximum. So you've got to ensure that in order for it to stay potable, it's maintained below that level. And I think these levels are set by the World Health Organization.
Now, in effect, what has happened in the immediately succeeding section is that you've been asked, well, if you were trying now to think of what could have been done to make things work better in terms of water, given the building you were dealing with and so on and so forth, what would you have needed to do? And on 309, original 102, you set out your own views on that topic, is that correct?
Yes.
And you start with the automatic dosing, which we've touched on. And then you suggest having an authorised engineer for water prior to handover. Does that seem sensible to you?
Yes.
And then the appointment of other appointees under the water appointee structure also prior to handover.
Yes.
And why are you suggesting that?
Well, I think if these posts had been in place prior to handover, they would have had the opportunity to influence the design, the testing, commissioning, validation, etc. And they would have been able to influence the process that was adopted. And they would be getting experience and knowledge of the system as they were going and be able to have the correct processes and procedures in place ahead of opening, rather than trying to implement that while you're doing all these other functions to get the building occupied.
And is that I don't need to get you to read it out, but is that the point, essentially, that you're making against little paragraph F on the page in front of you now from 309? You suggest at least 6 months.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you make other, no doubt, helpful suggestions as to things that could conveniently be in place. 310, another product crops up, which I don't think we've touched on so far, called Sanosil.
Oh yes.
What's that?
Sanosil's the silver peroxide or silver hydrogen peroxide that was used as the original sanitant by a multiplex for sanitisation of the water system prior to handover.
Right.
And then we adopted that for our sanitisation process for continuity and to ensure that with the same efficacy as had been recommended for the process.
If we look on 311, original 104, do we find that this caused a particular issue with Optitherm? Now, TMT means thermal mixing taps, is that right?
Yes.
Was there a particular issue with that tap?
Well, I think that's part of the reason that the Sanicil dosing level was set at what it was. I think Multiplex had consulted the manufacturer,
Yes.
and the manufacturer had advised to sanitise at that level in order to mitigate any risks there would be to the Optotherm TMT. Horn Engineering, who make that tap, had, I don't know if I'm maybe preempting what you're going to ask next on
No,
that.
it's all right. We're coming to that shortly, but that's a particular type of tap that you had quite a lot of involvement with. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think the point might be a sort of question. Well, does this not seem a bit odd to be using something less than the recommended dose just
Yes.
because of a warranty issue?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would say that should have been challenged at the time, yes.
Thank you.
Just so that I'm following, did you say that the active constituent of Sanicil is, did I hear you saying silver peroxide?
I think, yeah, silver.
Is it peroxide?
I don't know if it's peroxide or silver hydrogen, but it's a silver based.
Okay. Maybe silver hydrogen peroxide. And the difficulty with the tap was it corrosion?
The manufacturer said that the taps should not be chemically sanitised, any chemical, because it would react with the components in the tap and the tap would fail as a result. There wasn't a timescale on it, just it would fail. Other components would fail. Their recommendation was it should only be thermally sanitised.
Thank you.
Well, let's just deal with taps. These are quite often referred to in the papers the inquiry have as the horn taps.
Yes.
Horn with an E at the end of it. And am I right in thinking that you were involved, at least for a short time, at the stage when these were being potentially selected for installation into the new hospital?
Yes, I was at the assessment meeting they had for the proposed option for taps. So I think from memory there was 3, maybe 4 taps that had been identified by Multiplex as being a potential for use on the project.
Beauty parade for taps.
Yes.
Right, and you had a particular concern about the horn taps.
I'd raised at the time on the fact that they said they should only be thermally sanitised. I'd raised my concerns that to thermally sanitise a system as large as this, they say that the tap can be sanitised at system temperature, which is 60 degrees. To thermally sanitise these taps at 60 degrees would need massive amounts of people involved, even if you broke it down into zones and sections, because you would have to have people there while the taps are running to ensure that patients and staff aren't getting scalded. So it's an impractical solution to implement a thermal sanitisation programme in an operational hospital, especially one of that size. And I had raised that as a concern. And Horn stood by their commitment that it should only be thermally sanitised.
Right. So yes, you told us that they've said, well, you can't use chemicals.
Yes.
It has to be done this way. Thank you. And we can probably take this reasonably short. It's dealt with on 314, original 107, that what you were talking, the sanitisation process that you were talking about that was recommended, you eventually found required the taps to be sanitised at 60 degrees for 20 minutes.
Yes.
And you had a view as to whether that was feasible in a ward.
Wasn't practical. 20 minutes of 60-degree water flowing through. Now, even if it was broken down to a ward at a time, you're talking about maybe 60 taps that you've got to have staff managing, monitoring and ensuring that nobody is touching these during that process. The taps have to be open to do this. and equally it doesn't sanitise the cold side of the tap, it only sanitises the hot. But there are connections that are provided by Horn to be attached to the tap to allow you to sanitise the cold. But then again, there's a process to do for that across, I think there's something like 2,500 Horn taps on the site, so.
What, it may be obvious, but why are you having to sanitize the taps? What are you trying to get rid of by the sanitizing?
Well, it's a process for sanitising against any stagnation, seldom used outlets, that kind of thing, or the issues round about the what they call the flow regulator. The flow regulator was subject to another guidance document to say that they should be removed. So it would be a sanitisation process for that as well.
Right, okay, well, in the hope of getting this reasonably short, what I understand, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that there was an outbreak of illness that affected very young babies, I think, in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Led to a recommendation that flow straighteners should be removed.
Regulator straightener, different names, yeah.
Yeah. From taps because they had been implicated
Yes.
in the illnesses which had led to unfortunate, I think, deaths in Northern Ireland.
Yes, I think there was 6.
And am I right in understanding that you couldn't just, unscrew the flow regulator from the Horn tap? It couldn't be done.
No. The guidance, the HPS guidance on Pseudomonas, which is the guidance you're talking about, said that all flow straighteners should be removed as a safety precaution. I've looked into that in partnership with Horn to say this is an edict that's coming out and we need to apply. And they said you can't do that on these taps. The regulator performs 3 different tasks. If you take them away, you defeat the function of the tap. I raised this with David Loudon and the project team, and that created a problem because obviously the guidance was saying one thing. We had a site that had been fitted out with these taps that couldn't be modified, and it would affect the project programme. So David asked me to set up a meeting with the manufacturers, Health Facility Scotland, HPS, and I think we had someone from Portendown, was it Walker, Dr. Walker, on that meeting as well. So the outcome of the meeting was that HPS came back with the same opinion that the regulator was still a point of risk and should be removed, and gave 3 options of how that could be achieved on our project. And one of the options was carry on as you are and manage the process, or the other options were basically both the same, different versions, remove the taps and put something else in. So David Loudon decided to retain the taps and put in a management process.
Yeah. And were you then charged with trying to work out how to sanitize if the 60 degrees for 20 minutes was not feasible? And did you come up with an alternative to 60 degrees for 20 minutes?
Wasn't an alternative. It was still using the thermal process, but my proposal was to do a service exchange process where we take
a tap off, put a new one on.
Put a new one on that's been processed, and then take that tap away and process it remotely, but at 70 degrees, so that we could sanitize it within 3 minutes. And I worked with Horn to procure the heat stations and the equipment to implement that. However, we didn't have a workshop facility to allow us to implement it at that time. We had to create that workshop facility and create a heat source that we could run and vary between 60 and 80 degrees, I think it was from memory.
So, was this all happening in 2015? Because at this stage, not all the taps had been installed. Is that right?
Well, 2015,
Or was it?
I don't know if there were still taps outstanding in the
Right.
children's, but 2015 in principle, they should have all been installed.
Right.
The actual meetings that we're talking about happened in 2014.
Right.
The process of working with Horn went through into 2015.
I think in fairness to you, at the very foot of 314, original 107, you're talking about working with Horn in June and July 2015. See that? Right.
Yeah, that's the development of the workshop. Yes,
Yeah,
yes. I mean that was the reason for that was obviously to get past all the migration issues, and then we procured the equipment to allow us to create the workshop, and I had asked David Bratty to take on the task of creating the workshop and creating the plate heat exchanger for running this Thameshire sanitation programme. That needed to be connected into the existing pipework so that we could generate, that would be the LTHW pipework, so that we could generate domestic hot water at 70 degrees.
Yeah, thank you very much. So if you look on to 315, original 108, at the top, you're talking there about getting the workshop created,
Yes.
and then saying that due to the pressure on him, he didn't get round to it.
He hadn't delivered it by the time they retired, and now that's from memory, probably about 2017. And then Paul McAllister took over his role, and I asked Paul to take that on, and Paul turned it around fairly quickly. But by the time it had been turned round, we were starting to have problems with the water system. So that process never really got implemented at that time.
I think what's usually referred to as the water incident was 2018. So
Yes.
does that mean that between 2015 and 2018, this wasn't operational?
Correct.
Sorry, when you say this was not operational, my fault for not keeping up. What do you mean by this?
I think I was meaning the intended ability to thermally sanitize at a location away from the wards.
Right.
On a service exchange, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Right. Can I ask you about another stage of events? What's usually called the water incident. Just before I take you to any documents, I mean, would I write that there was a group set up to deal with it, called the Water Technical Group or something of that kind?
There was after the IMT had been set up, yes.
Yes. And we'll see in a minute, that contained all kinds of representatives from different interests. That's so, and were you involved in that?
I was.
And in simple terms, was one of the exercises that group was doing, finding out whether you had at the new hospital what was described as widespread contamination in all kinds of different locations.
Well, that was a kind of combination between the IMT and the Water Technical Group. As they started to find more positive results in patients, in the bloodstream results, and started casting the net wider in terms of testing, but still specifically Ward 2A at the time. They were getting to a stage where they were looking at possible decant facilities. And then we started looking further afield at the decant facility and testing there to find that we were having problems there as well. So I think that would be the catalyst for wider spread test programs.
And when you say wider spread, that's not just 2A, that's all over the hospital, is it?
Well, we started 2A and then 4B, and then we started testing all over, including risers, water tanks, that kind of thing, as we started to see that we had a more systemic problem.
I do have some minutes of these meetings, but I may not need But you just used the phrase a systemic problem. Was that a conclusion reached by this group?
Ultimately, yeah.
Well, let me just look at one of these so we know what we're talking about. Could we look at bundle 10? It's document 1, but it's page 9. And do we see there what's called a water review meeting in this case? A meeting with Mr. McLaughlin from HFS, Annette Rankin from HPS, Mr. Gallagher we know, Mr. Kennedy.
He was a public health doctor.
Right. And Mr. Purden you've mentioned, and a Mr. Storer who's also from HFS.
Yes.
And potentially there should have been Mary Ann Kane and someone called Alexandra Marek, and there's an admin assistant to help.
Just on the question of what we're calling this, it's headed water review meeting, but it's a meeting of, if I'm following, the water technical group.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
And can we just follow that document down, please, just so we see roughly what's being done at that meeting? There's a spreadsheet of results. Outcome is being mapped on floor plans. Is this all familiar to you?
Yes.
And then there's talk about where to test next and so on. And you make some suggestions about that. Can we just carry on, please, on the same document? Then probably the next page. And there's discussion of sundry other issues. There's another acronym appears under the heading agreed to, POUF.
That's point of use filter.
Right.
So these are the filters that were installed retrospectively on the tap outlets.
Right.
So that's an absolute filter so that whatever's in the system isn't coming out to the patient.
So even if you have a problem in the water, you can filter it out by this filter. It doesn't sort what the problem is in the water, but
No,
it stops the recipient of that water having a problem.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. If I put these simplistic things to you, Mr. Powrie, and you think they're wrong, please just tell me. So just carrying on down that page, talking about random tests, and then there's a note in the middle just before the next POUF. Every floor had positive and negative readings, thereby this would indicate a widespread water infection.
Sorry, I'm not with you, where is
Sorry, you see 0 to 3 in RHC and 4 to 11 in adult.
Yes.
And just beneath that, the sentence there.
I've got you, yeah.
And is that effectively what you were talking about?
Systemic, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that was us starting to see that it was widespread.
Yeah. And these meetings then continued later on in 2018 to do the same exercise, essentially continue to test and then work out what to do about it.
Yes.
And is that the point at which the option of putting in chemical dosing started to emerge?
Yeah, it was really the only way that we were going to get now to control the contamination that was in the system. Flushing and now refilling and flushing and all that wouldn't have addressed that. And there was multiple issues that we found investigating the system as well that were contributing to the problem.
Thank you.
And what I'm rather gathering is that, as a matter of language, in April of 2018, everybody concerned was using the term contamination of the water system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the phrase that we've just looked at is widespread water infection.
Yeah.
Can you remember, is that a phrase that recurs as you go through these minutes?
Yeah, I mean, the contamination, the water infection, in effect, the same thing.
And it was agreed that it was widespread, i.e. not just confined to 2A or 4C or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about it, as I would call it, systemic.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I won't trouble you with further minutes simply to the same effect, but can I bring you then back to your statement at 316, original 109, the second half of that page. And here you're talking about chlorine dioxide, which you touched on earlier in your oral evidence. And you said an external specialist, Mr. Wafer,
Yes,
was brought in to help. Is that right?
yes,
Is this something you were involved in, the development of the dosing system?
yes. I worked with Tim Wafer to take advice on his experience and what the best products were, and that was compared with other experiences from now infection control team, etc. In Glasgow, we had wide experience of using chlorine dioxide as an effective biocide, so it kind of fell in line with what was expected.
Right. So I'm keen just to understand that the process. I mean, one can understand if you're a householder and you have a single sink and you pour some bleach down it, that's what you may be trying to disinfect an individual item. But if you're looking at dosing the entire water system of the new hospital, is that a rather bigger operation?
It's quite complex. Some systems, what they do is, especially if you're doing it from day one, they treat the water tank, storage tanks, and then that disperses through the system and treats the system. Our system was already infected, and it was very large and complex. It had, I think, something like 9 different distribution systems within that, fed from the same tanks. So even if we dosed the tanks and then distributed that through the system, the likelihood is we couldn't dose it strong enough to get the end result at each of the taps. So we looked at installing dosing systems on all the subsystems so that they would then be getting the top-up dosages. They would treat the tanks, and then they would get topped up at each of the sub-distribution systems as well to maintain the appropriate level required to actively work on the contamination.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is how long did this take to put into operation?
In terms of procurement and installation,
yes.
and then ramping the doses up.
Yes.
Looking back at it, I think we managed to turn it around in something like 6 months, which was quite. Now that was, and most of that with procurement delays, etc. But that was quite a quick turnaround, I would say, especially having it installed and operational within that time frame, considering the level of installation that was required.
And would I be right in thinking, as a matter of logic, that if you have widespread water contamination, although on day one you push the button on your shiny new dosing system, it takes a while for that to work to all the elements of the complex system. Is that correct?
Yes. So what happens there is the chemical is treated into the system, and if you put it in, say, at 0.5 ppm, with the expectation it's going to be lower than that at the outlet, what you do is you measure what they call the residual chemical at the outlets to see how much chemical you've got left from the amount that you put in, and that gives you an indication of whether the chemical has been used up actively by combating whatever's in the system, or whether it's coming out the outlet at the level you put it in, which means that there's no activity to combat. So that takes time to establish and to build up a residual that indicates that the product's doing its job.
Right. So are you able to offer any indication of how long you once you get to the point of deciding to do it, which is what, sometime in 2018?
Yeah.
After these investigations at the Water Technical Group, and you get Mr. Wafer in, take advice, get on to procurement. You think it took about 6 months to installation. I'm just trying to get some kind of flavour of how long it takes to get to the point where you've hopefully eliminated the problem.
Well, the system went live in November 18, I think it was. And we were seeing positive indications that it was doing what we wanted it to do by about April, May.
When you say the system arrived, is that it online and operating?
Well, the system, it was multiple systems. So we installed those and we installed them, I would say, over a 3-month window. And they went live in November. So that means we put them online, not simultaneously, but within a day of each other. And as I say, I think around about April, May, we were starting to see indications that the sample results were improving and the residual chlorine dioxide measures were starting to stabilise. So that was indicating that it was doing what was expected.
Now, Mr. Connell put to you, a decision was made sometime in 2018. I take it was sometime after April 2018.
Yes.
Can you estimate when the decision to implement dosing was made?
I would say it would be about May, because I think it was June that we started procurement or work towards procurement.
Thank you.
And the procurement process was cut back as well, because normally we would have to, a project of that size would go through the OJU process.
The what process?
OJU, it's the European Journal for
Oh, yes,
Procurement.
so OEJU.
Yeah, that's the procurement regulation.
Yes.
Yes.
So normally we would have to go through that, and that would take 6 months just to do that on its own.
Yeah.
So we had shortcut that and went through a notification process for the European Journal, and we got sign off of what they call a waiver to tender by the chief execs to bring that process down and make it shorter.
Right. So you reckon about 6 months from, say, June to it
Yeah, I would say May, June, yeah.
being operational in November, and then by May of 2019,
Yeah.
things are, you think, showing.
Yeah, I think there was confidence by then that it was doing what was required.
Thank you. Which is starting to head towards the point at which you retire in July of 2019.
Yes.
Yeah. Fine. I just want to ask you a couple of, one sort of definitional point. In your statement 319, original 112, you use the term, or the term is used, single barrier system for water. Now, again, I think we can probably take this quite short. Does that just mean that there is in place a single system for trying to ensure water is free from contaminant?
Yeah, like a control mechanism.
Yeah.
In this case, it was temperature.
Yeah. And what you set out on that page is your thesis that, well, there was a single barrier, but there could have been belt and braces system with dosing as well.
Yes.
And possibly also these point of use filters in special areas.
Yes.
Point of use filters comes up on the next page, 320, original 113, where you're talking about doing a meeting, an IMT meeting on a Saturday.
Yes, that was at the early stages of the highlighted concerns over patients and their bloodstream test results. So there was a meeting on the Saturday, I think it was on the Saturday, to take advantage of access to a specialist, trying to remember his name. Again, he was from
Mr. Hoffman, maybe?
Peter Hoffman, that's it.
He's mentioned in your paragraph in your statement.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that it was held on the Saturday to take advantage of his advice and access to his advice, and obviously to mobilise a response as quickly as possible.
And you've asked, but you don't remember the precise date of that meeting, but you think it's at the early stages of what we're
yeah.
calling the water incident?
Yes. At that point, we hadn't installed point of use filters anywhere. So this was the first point we were considering point of use filters for Ward 2A, and then that grew as we started to see other problems.
If these are a kind of guarantee that whatever the state of the system, the water coming out of a particular tap is fine, why weren't they in earlier, you know?
Well, again, it's based on the fact that if you've got a system that's clean and doing its job, there's no need for them. However, there is a school of thought now that they should be installed in high-risk wards as a matter of standard.
Thank you.
Are there downsides associated with point of use filters?
Sorry, say that again?
Are there any downsides, any disadvantages or problems that you have to manage?
They've got to be changed at a regular frequency depending on the type. You can get 31-day life, 61-day life, and I think there's a 90-day life filter. So you've got to have a replacement programme to ensure that you don't exceed that period. There's a risk of the users interfering with them or knocking them off the tap, negating their value. And the only other one I can think of is financial cost.
Right.
Thank you.
Do they materially change the distance between the
They do.
the point of delivery of the water,
Yes.
and the basin?
Yeah, they do. But in our case, the original taps were mounted about 500 millimetres above the wash hand basin. So putting these on reduced that by about 100 millimetres. So you still had an acceptable gap.
Right.
In most cases. So you get some small wash hand basins that aren't clinical, that you didn't have the same scenario. And if these were being protected, that would be more of an issue.
Thank you.
I just have a couple of questions I propose to put to the witness, then I'm suggesting what time will come for the lunch break. There's just a couple of detailed points I'd take first, if I may.
You propose before lunch?
Before lunch.
Right.
And then we come on to a topic afterwards.
There's a matter I want to take up
Well,
with Mr. Powrie as well, but carry on.
On 323, which is original 116, there starts a narrative, and the narrative essentially is there's a suggestion that estates or you or someone in estate wouldn't give water testing results to doctors who asked for them.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
No, I've never been aware of that. I mean, I know that there was some glitches, but there was never any deliberate with results being withheld.
Thank you. Well, I think, in fact, I would probably stop there, my lord. So if the lord has a point, okay.
Right. Mr. Powrie, can I just run you through points I think you made very clearly. It's in relation to horn taps. So, and tell me if I'm wrong about any of this. Situation arose in 2015 where there was a question about whether horn taps should be used because of the experience in the Belfast hospital.
Yes, Pseudomonas guidance, yeah.
Right. And the question was, or the issue was, that this particular tap design was associated with accumulation of infection. And I think you mentioned Pseudomonas, if I'm
Yes.
right. So this was recognized in Glasgow in 2015. And the advice from the manufacturer of the tap was that chemical disinfectant would have made the tap ineffective because, or maybe am I mixing this up with removal of flow straighteners? Correct me on this.
There's two. The manufacturer's concern with the use of chemical sanitants was that they would adversely affect the materials in the tap. Now, they weren't saying that would happen right away. They're saying over time the materials will fail because they're not resistant to the chemicals. The removal of the flow regulator, the guidance from HPS was that the flow regulator was a source of risk, and recommendation is that they be removed. Now, there was a caveat that they didn't need to be removed retrospectively. No, sorry, the taps didn't need to be changed retrospectively from existing hospitals. And that's, I think, where David Loudon focused on here, that they were installed in our hospital, and although we weren't open, it was still retrospective. But I think that was his thinking.
So situations arisen, I think you said there was maybe as many as 60 taps at various points in the hospital.
Well, in one ward, there may be 60 of these horn taps.
Sorry, let me get my figures right. I put to you 60 taps, but maybe that's a gross underestimate.
Yes. There's about 2,500
right,
horn taps.
But maybe 60 in one
ward, yes.
Right. That's 2015. Now, you proposed a solution to, or rather, a means of sanitizing, which would have involved removal of the tap, take them to the workshop, and run through water at 70 degrees centigrade.
Yes.
Right. That did not happen for a number of reasons. And between 2015 and 2018, the problem which had been identified in 2015 simply was not addressed.
No.
Thank you. Well, I think that takes us to about 1 o'clock, and if it's convenient to you,
indeed.
Mr. Connell, we will take our lunch break, and can I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock, Mr. Powrie?
Okay,
Thank you.
Please stand.